So the focus of my presentation is this working paper published in 2022. It's called Leaving No Country Behind, a monetary contribution to close the climate finance gap. So this is the structure of the paper. We'll start with the general climate change context on which this research is based. The paper then moves on to the global climate finance gap, as well as climate injustice, reviewing some of the policies which currently exist, as well as those which are on the table. The paper then makes its own recommendations, and then I'll move on to my own analysis of the paper. So the paper begins by highlighting the severity of climate change, which has been brought about by a worldwide insistence on the burning of fossil fuels and the resultant greenhouse gas emissions. The paper reinforces the increasing urgency with which countries and their industries must take adequate action in the form of investment and policies in order to avoid hitting what they describe as destructive thresholds, which essentially would make the damage irreversible. So as you can see on the graph here, we've got the projections of numerous scenarios which have been set out, and none of them are particularly sort of good in terms of reaching the goals set during the Paris Agreement, which are 1.5 to 2 degrees Celsius warming. So the paper then identifies the notion of a global finance gap, which is essentially the amount of additional investment into climate mitigation and adaptation which is required globally. It's estimated that the gap stands around $3.5 trillion, and the IMF believe that 3.6 trillion per year is required until 2050, whereas the OECD say that the amount is $5 to $7 trillion per year by 2030. So the paper kind of paints a picture of climate injustice, which is basically the notion that although the global north countries are those most responsible for emitting the most greenhouse gases, it's invariably those in the global north which suffer the economic and environmental consequences. Not only this, but it's actually developing countries which are, as you can see, required to increase their expenditure as a proportion of their GDP to a greater extent than developed countries. So it's 4.9% of GDP as opposed to 2.4% for global north countries. There seems to be a general consensus among many economies which suggest that the costs attached to switching to renewable energy sources are just simply too high, and hence they choose to burn fossil fuels as they're kind of perceived to be more cost effective and generally easier. The reality though is that investments into green energy sources is imperative and also urgent. However, the majority of the investment which has gone into climate mitigation and adaptation has been primarily from developed countries and China. It's imperative that developed countries implement strategies which alleviate the burden for low-income countries and enable them to make the necessary investments, as the benefits certainly outweigh the costs in the long run at least. For example, a worldwide switch from coal exploitation to the equivalent capacity of renewable energy source would cost 29 trillion in upfront costs, but the overall net benefit of the switch is estimated to be 78 trillion in avoided costs. So there are already a number of policies which developed countries are using in order to help those which are low income, in order to mobilize sort of them financially in terms of fighting the climate crisis. So you've got the Debt Service Suspension Initiative, the Common Framework, Debt for Climate Swaps, Official Development Assistance, the Global Climate Commitment. We've got 2 IMF trusts, the Poverty Reduction and Growth Trust, and also the Resilience and Sustainability Trust. We've also got private finance. So despite these, currently there are still more proposals on the table in terms of policies. This paper assesses these with regards to their potential efficacy in terms of facilitating adequate climate mitigation and adaptation infrastructure. The independent high-level expert group on climate finance actually says that the majority of the growth needs to come from the private sector within the developing countries. Examples of public and or private funding include the Marshall Plan, multilateral development banks, and the option to scale up loan guarantees. Secondly, we've got special drawing rights, or SDRs. These are the primary form of recourse which is recommended by the paper itself, and hence most of the suggestions are centered around this. So what are SDRs? Well, they're an artificial interest-bearing currency instrument created by the IMF, which can be used in exchange for real currencies or also to repay loans or interest. They're granted by the IMF and held by member countries to increase their reserves, and can also be recycled using voluntary trade agreements and also in a number of other ways which will be discussed later in the paper. With regards to how these can be used, the Barbados agenda was published in 2022. This calls for seed money of $500 billion, either in the form of new SDRs or other funds, and leverage up to $5 trillion in new private lending, whilst also calling for $200 billion per year in loss and damage payments to those countries that are worst impacted by climate change. So the paper doesn't actually believe the current proposals or the policies that are currently in place to be effective in terms of reducing the climate gap in time to sort of save the Earth from irreparable damage. So it's made 5 of its own recommendations, one of which is to rechannel $100 billion worth of SDRs from high income to low income countries, also to rechannel idle SDRs through the Resilience and Sustainability Trust, examine the climate finance gap every 3 years and allocate SDRs accordingly, also to replace the existing dual interest rate with just a single rate, which is levied only on unutilized SDRs. And lastly, to speed up debt restructuring initiatives to aid highly indebted countries utilizing SDRs. So from my perspective, the paper has numerous advantages. Overall, it's a well-written academic paper substantiated on reliable, pertinent data. And on the whole, it provides a useful theoretical analysis of the current state of climate finance, as well as the scale of development needed to close the gap sufficiently. However, I've chosen these 2 advantages in particular to discuss in a bit more detail. And these are the extensive analysis of SDRs, as well as the compelling pro-climate finance agenda. We've got the extensive analysis of SDR. So in a time where many countries perhaps struggle with liquidity, SDRs can almost be seen as a bit of a bailout from the IMF, which essentially, given the circumstances surrounding climate change and the immediacy of the actions required, this needs to be utilised to the fullest extent. So the paper acknowledges that SDRs are irrefutably a vital tool in the closing the finance gap. They focus on them in great detail and use them as the focal point of future climate change, comprehensively outlining the obvious benefits and the transmission methods through which they can enable financial mobility. But they also critically discuss their potential implementation by identifying current drawbacks such as the interest burden and their inability to be used as grants or perpetual loans. So a couple of other papers have also sort of acknowledged the importance of SDRs. The paper by Plans has stated that the scale of residual SDRs, which is equivalent to $100 billion among G20 countries, is too substantial to recycle by simply loaning back to the IMF, as the Poverty Reduction and Growth Trust and Resilience Sustainability Trust are unable to absorb the full amount. So recycling them using MDBs is a perfectly viable option for these countries, and is also kind of a win-win, as it allows them to recycle their SDRs, obviously, and this can enable financial mobilization for those in need. The paper by Cashman also agrees with the importance of SDRs, states a few of their advantages. So they can be mobilized quickly, they can be exchanged for hard currency on demand, and SDR allocations are cost-free, and for those who exchange hard currency in exchange for them, earn interest. So another win-win. So another advantage is the way the paper presents a persuasive case for the need to increase climate finance. It shines light on the current real-life impacts of climate change, as well as those which are expected to occur. It gives the reader context, and also kind of gives the reader a reason why they should also believe the same agenda and take the same stance towards climate finance. The paper effectively conveys the true magnitude and the immediacy of the crisis. In a world where many view environmental preservation as merely an afterthought, engaging in short-sighted, profit-oriented business practices and corporate governance, as well as the rather lenient government policy towards pollution in many areas of the world. The paper emphasised repeatedly the urgent need to close the finance gap in order to maintain planet Earth as we know it. And they make quite a few powerful points. It really makes you think why so many major economies, so many industries just simply aren't doing enough as things stand. Despite this, we've also got a few disadvantages of the analysis. So the first disadvantage I've identified is the lack of domestic policy suggestions. So I personally find the paper quite limiting and fairly one-dimensional in terms of examining ways in which the finance gap can be closed. The paper does acknowledge that a large proportion of the current gap must be financed by the private sector within the developing countries themselves. However, it makes very little reference to specific policies which currently exist, nor suggests policies which could in future exist in terms of the private sector or even the public sector within the developing countries. It focuses primarily on financial measures such as international public finance policies, However, I found a paper by Bandari which acknowledges a lot of financial measures and the necessity for these. However, it also includes an analysis of market-based incentives and de-risking policies, which shouldn't be ignored. The Bandari paper actually identifies 9 different policies which are all empirically proven to be effective in at least one of the specified criteria. So in terms of mobilization, economic efficiency, environmental integrity, and equity. For instance, take FIT, so feed-in tariff. These offer payments to households to incentivize clean energy installations, and also loan guarantees whereby governments cover borrowers' debt obligations if the borrower embarks on unsuccessful climate projects. These two are proven to be empirically incredibly efficient and effective. In terms of the criteria set out by Bandari, however, these policies are not mentioned at all by the Van Tilburg paper. Another criticism or disadvantage of this paper would probably be the fact that it's a purely theoretical analysis of what is needed in terms of SDR commitments, which perhaps is not the most effective form of analysis in this kind of situation. I find it provides quite a limited insight into the end results of such commitments, and therefore, as a reader, it's difficult to envisage sort of what kind of impact this would have for developing countries and whether this can be considered effective or not. For example, the suggestions to rechannel $100 billion of SDRs from high-income countries to developing countries, and also to use the idle SDRs in order to increase the pledged amount from 100 billion to 400 billion. We don't really have any idea of the exact impact this would have because it's just kind of theoretical analysis. Sorry, a couple of papers have kind of taken this further, such as Sprott and Ashford. They more specifically state that the $100 billion USD figure quoted by Van Tilburg, if committed by developing countries, has the ability to lead to $7 billion annual climate change mobilization. Another paper by Chowdhury and Sundaram as well suggests that the idle bonds of $100 billion annually could be used to back floating bonds, which could in fact create $1 trillion for climate finance. Again, this is not an empirical analysis. However, it does raise the question of whether the Van Tilburg paper have significantly underestimated the power potential of SDRs. Thirdly, while the paper does briefly refer to the moral duty of the global north to provide support to low-income countries, perhaps a slightly more cynical viewpoint would suggest that the primary focus appears to be preserving the planet as a means of protecting developed countries in the long run, and kind of limiting their costs of the expected damage. In my opinion, there's probably not quite enough light shed on the poverty impacts that these countries already have and which are likely to be exacerbated by climate change. So for decades, a significant part of the global south has been suffering from acute poverty and famine. Part of this is due to just simply not receiving enough support from developed countries. But obviously, there are myriad factors. But it seems like now there's a genuine threat to long-term prosperity of economic growth in the global north. Like now there's more of a clamour for immediate transfers. However, the paper by Nakuda explains that not all policies which deliver mitigation against greenhouse gas emissions also provide benefit in terms of poverty and or inequality. It's also the case, however, that not all policies which are aimed to sort of solve or ease poverty are necessarily beneficial to the environment, so there is inevitably a trade-off there.